Yes, welcome. This is A RAP CRITIC. I'm your boy Malik 16, founder and creator of Plates and Crates. And no, we don't accept Tupac slander on this channel, but every now and then we might let this album play without skipping Drop a Gem. Don't tell nobody, right? If you have not guessed already, the album that we are talking about, I mean, you should know from the cover that you clicked on to get to this video, but the album that we are talking about today continues our 1996 for the rest of the year campaign, and there's only a few more episodes left until the year's over, so we got a few more to turn out before we call it a day on our celebration of albums turning 25 this year. This album just happened to have its 25th anniversary this month. I think about a week and a half ago. So we're right on time with this. We're talking about none other than Hell on Earth by Mobb Deep. And yeah, if you have not already, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. And if you haven't noticed the drip, this is exclusive Malik 16 design work here. This is a part of the launch of our A RAP CRITIC merch. I'll leave the link so you can see the shirt in full, but this is the official shirt for the I Used to Love Her scale. And you'll see the link for it at the end of this video. And I'll get more into it in subsequent videos, but just letting you know what's coming. And yes, with no further ado, this is category 1, where we go over the album itself, the product. And a little history on this album. It was released in 1996. It is the 3rd album by the group. A lot of people believe it to be the sophomore album. This is album number 3, Trace. So yeah, category 1, let's jump to dimension 1, quality of production. Anyone who understands who Mobb Deep is knows that the name is almost synonymous with Havoc production. Now, that wasn't always the case. Prodigy started out as a leading producer in the group, but fell back once he understood that Havoc took to the production aspect of the group like a fish to water. And so this album really allowed Havoc to hone his sound, where they created a sound on The Infamous, which was the album preceding this. That sound relied heavily on horns and voices. So you get these dark horns, and you know, there was some elements of atmospheric sounds, but this album takes it up a notch, where Havoc is going to do his signature clack drum. So, you know, one thing that Havoc is infamous for, no pun intended, is these simple snares and drum kicks that kind of just set the stage for the sounds that you really came there for, which are the dark, haunting sounds that Mobb Deep has become known for. So you're gonna get these boom, clack, boom, clack, boom, clack. Again, hollow kicks for most of his beats, especially on the Infamous album. Here that continues. And then you also get a signature Havoc crackle. What Havoc liked to play with is the effect of an old phonograph record. And so sometimes that's because it's actually sampled that way. And a lot of times, I think by this album, it just became another signature in his beat repertoire. So a lot of the songs on here start with that old time feeling, that gritty, gristled crackle as the beat continues. So it's not even just for the intro or the outro. It's all throughout the song, so it gives it this griminess, right? With those clack drums. But here, like I mentioned, more atmospheric sounds because there's more use of synths and violins. And then on top of all of that, way more songs that have piano keys as the lead. So the horns are gone in favor for these synths that sound dark classical more than anything else. And violins that actually sound very dark classical. Havoc's bass lines are always preferentially not rattling bass, just real low bottom bass that drives the darkness home. And then you get piano led beats like Get Dealt With Quick and Drop a Gem on them. And so what this does is there's a cryptic feel, there's a serious feel, there's still some of those go-to sounds. There's still use of voices. On Still Shining, the very second thing you hear after the first note of the organ is the voice, the oh, and this was a leading street single. You know, this just shows you what flew and what was allowed in 1996. You know, this was a single. And, you know, you're getting all of those things that I think at this point cemented Havoc's production sound. It made him the sound that you wait for. It made him a name among everyone's top 10, especially on the East Coast, especially among New York producers. Havoc was even top 5, top 3 at this point in time. People wanted that sound for their albums. You either wanted those haunting voices, those haunting keys, those haunting strings, or even, you know, return to the horns when you can get them. On the infamous, you had guest production from Q-Tip on Drink Away the Pain, right? Which took it into this jazzy place that, you know, was only visited on a few other tracks on that album, but jazzy in a different way. So jazzy, QU, Hectic, and, you know, Up North Trip were jazzy, but that's because of the horns that were used and because of the sample that was used. Here, no Q-Tip, but the same nod to their fellow Queens representative is put in place when they use the famous drum pattern from Bonita Appleball and splice that with the sample from Scarface, the intro to the movie Scarface, which no one had ever done before, and which, if you listen closely enough, you could tell is slightly off beat, but Havoc made it match perfectly. So it goes in this kind of club-ready pattern. This is the beginning of Mobb Deep kind of having this legacy of one club banger per album. So every album, they would have one song that was never supposed to rock in the clubs, but not just enough. This album carried on the tradition with having The Godfather Part 3 as a single where, you know, people's minds were blown that the Scarface intro was sampled so well over something already familiar like the Bonita Applebone drums, which was only made more famous and popular because the same year the Fuji sampled that same drum pattern for Killing Me Softly, which was a mega hit. So this was a win-win kind of circumstance. There was just no way that single could have faltered. So that's the kind of production you get here on this album. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that's leading us into dimension 2, the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. So Havoc created this foundation of haunting, atmospheric production. You also understand that there's a cinematic quality, and the thing that separates this kind of cinematic production from other cinematic production at the time is that it seemed relegated to one genre. This is psychological thriller, this is chiller thriller, slasher, grindhouse, somebody's gonna die type movie. And Mobb Deep managed to escape the horrorcore hip-hop label because they weren't going into ridiculous territory. It maintained its street feel because of those boom bap clack drums that made it undeniably hip-hop and of the times without going into super creepy experimental territory. It's cryptic and haunting without being creepy and experimental, right? So, you know, they're also not describing things in a way that's like crazy gory. It's gory like Bloody Knuckles gory, but not chopping your head off, you know? And so with that, you know, when you get softer beats here, Godfather Part 3 might be considered one of the softer beats because of the Bonita Applebone drums. And then Extortion, B-side with Method Man, was probably one of the calmest tracks on here because of it's these like muted piano notes and these like siren sounds that are not blaring sirens. So it's like panned, really like everything was pretty muted on that production. And so that's what we mean about softer, because you're gonna get more aggressive beats like Nighttime Vultures and Man Down that attack you. Give It Up Fast, Apostles Warning, those beats attack you. They come at you relentlessly. So by the time you get to like Bloodsport and Extortion, where the sounds are more muted, it's a nice break from that. And Havoc gives you enough variety while staying in this genre. And that is usually what makes a good movie, right? So you get that same element here on the audio tip. It's staying in its genre. It's staying in its lane, but giving you different shades and tones within that lane. You get those muted, softer aspects of dark and gritty, and then you get those more aggressive and just lively tones of dark and gritty. Hell on Earth, Bloodsport, Extortion, those would be the softer sides of dark, right? Hell on Earth, really unexpected sound from Mobb Deep, but because of those drums and that bass line. So it's that muted Wurlitzer sound on Hell on Earth that's a departure from the traditional Havoc production and then production that you see or anywhere else on the album. But it also is what made it radio friendly enough to get played. But it's really that bass line and those drums that maintain the street feel of it. But still having soulfulness. When you listen to Hell on Earth, there's a soulfulness. So much so that on a Funkmaster Flex album that came after, Erykah Badu sang over this beat and it worked. And so not once do you escape that. There's no deviation. Nothing sounds out of alignment on this album. More Trife Life is, the quintessential beat for this album. If you think of the production on Hell on Earth, More Trife Life kind of sums it up. The beats alone tell a story from beginning to the end. It starts off with animal instinct with the dark synths, and then you hear the bass line, the drums come in, and you know it's the beginning of the movie. And then it ends with Apostle's Warning, which sounds just like its title, with the voices echoing out and letting you know that it's not over. So even when pretty instruments like harpsichords are used, it's not for pretty effect. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 3, the overall tone and mood of the album. Without a doubt, there's no need to even pose this as a question. There is an overall tone and mood on this album. There's a darkness and there's a fullness with a hollow effect, if that makes sense, or a hollowness with a full effect. And that's something to really, really like sit back on and try to make sense of, because it's a contradiction, right? That's what the album is. It's not supposed to work. It's supposed to fall in with like a Gravediggers album. It's supposed to be that deep and dark, but Mobb Deep always had this charm and appeal that made them accessible for radio, street, and that underground feel. They were accepted on all platforms. One of the only rap acts I've seen like that where it works. And so the mood on this album continues effortlessly, flawlessly, continues whatever was put in effect by The Infamous. It seems like the perfect sequel, which also makes sense why a lot of people think this is the sophomore album, because The Infamous was most of the masses' first time knowing who Mobb Deep was, right? So this was everything that a Mobb Deep fan could ask for in a continuation. It's almost like when a sequel delivers and you couldn't ask for much more. So where it takes you, that's always, a personal interpretation, but what can't be denied is the feel of it. The emotion, the darkness, the grittiness, and making sure it match with the vocals. And the vocals for sure match with the tone of the album. And the tone is dark 90s New York. No joke. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Dimension 4, the song distinction versus repetition of words and sounds. So, one producer, one genre, right, for this movie. And I hope you're with me when, I'm using this movie metaphor here. It runs the risk of getting repetitive. How Havoc is able to pull off this many songs without it being repetitive, it depends. I mean, every time a beat starts with a dark crackling synth, if you consider that repetitive, that's something you want to take into account. But because there's different octaves used for each of those sounds on the different songs, I see the variation. And because there's different kinds of synths, different kinds of piano, different kinds of melodies for each, I think the only thing that gets repetitious here is the drum patterns. And then again, I mentioned you're so distracted by what you came there for, which is all the other sounds that have layers on top of those drums, that unless you're a real, production snob, you're not caring. You're not caring that you heard that same clack so many times, because look at what you're getting. You're getting vultures in the background. You're getting airport takeoff sounds and someone just randomly, oh, like what? Now, when you come to the words, Mobb Deep does have a limited repertoire of what they talk about. And if we're talking about a mood being set here of grimy 90s New York with a haunting feel, that's what you're getting. Prodigy was still considered one of the top tier lyricists at the time, at least coming from New York. And so his penchant for using more selective word choice here was kind of at its high. He was definitely digging in his bag and playing with words more, so not a lot of the same language per song. Now you're gonna hear things repeated, obviously, that are part of their marking, which is, the infamous MOBB, 41st Side. You're hearing all of that stuff. You're gonna hear that. You're gonna hear them shout out their crew, QB City, a lot of that. The material is gonna surround the same thing, but not so much the words and sounds. It's up to you what you consider to be repetitious, but I don't know if anything is repetitive in any glaring way. Something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats takes us to dimension 5. Now, the amount of content versus the amount of songs. Okay, it's Mobb Deep. They don't get very deep. The depth that you find is going to be within the scope of how hopeless, how grimy and gritty, and how much misery loves company, how volatile they can get. Those are the depths, but you're not getting deep in the sense of, social commentary or life commentary or any autobiographical content here. I was brought up and taught to have no fear. That's the scope here. So Mobb Deep wasn't known for that, and somehow they managed to get away with crafting these memorable classic albums that don't give you a lot of critical thinking or food for thought. It's just more about the mood that's being induced in some of the quotables here. So on an album with, let's look at the amount of songs here. Yeah, there's 14 tracks on this album, and with the exception of maybe Hell on Earth, on Bloodsport they go on to talk about the nature of their raps and how they pioneered this violent rap. Prodigy mentions in one of the verses, one of the lines, and so they're very aware of what they're doing. Maybe on songs like More Trife Life, which is a story. Again, it works. I think it works mostly because Havoc crafted this soundscape where it gives you enough variety to make you want to listen to the next song and how they all blend together. But something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, the content versus the amount of songs. Does it kill it for you? Does all the killing kill it for you? Does the lack of topical song making here make you feel like, there's some weakness? Dimension 6, the features. Who's featured on this album? Well, most notably, you're gonna have Raekwon the Chef and you have Nas. Maybe not as much as on the infamous album where they were both together on the song Eye for an Eye, which is, again, a New York classic, an underground classic, a catalog classic. They're on individual songs here, and then you get people within the Mobb Deep fold. You get rapper Noid, or Big Noid, and then you get the newly formed or put to the forefront where we knew they had a name, the infamous Mob. So you get members like Tom Nitty and Gambino, right? And so they're featured on there, here and there, sprinkled in. And as usual on Mobb Deep albums on this time, it wasn't make or break. You came here to hear Prodigy rap over Havoc production mostly. The features were just sprinkles and compliments. Sometimes you needed big noise energy on a track like Man Down to just kind of complement the cold calmness of Prodigy's, presentation and Havoc's presentation. And so getting features like Nas and Raekwon, those are highlights, but they weren't make or break. Raekwon adds to the mood of Nighttime Vultures, and Nas adds to the cinematic feel of Give It Up Fast. But the most dynamic feature here is going to be Method Man, because it's an unexpected contrast. Up until then, we heard Mobb Deep with rappers who rap about the same kind of content and kind of rap with the same emotion as them. Method Man comes in with more of the slick wordplay and just a different contrast of voice that made it interesting, let alone on one of the more, like I said, softer beats with that muted production. His cameo is like a nice break and a breath of fresh air, and that kind of felt like, ooh, this was the collab we didn't know we needed. So I would say Method Man is a standout, but that's something for you all to consider, whether or not the features on here help or hurt, and how good the features were on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 7, the weakest song. Does the weakest song on here take away or bring it down? Is there even a weak song? What are they? What is it? I think it's been mentioned in articles before. There was an article back in the day around the time this album came out, either in Vibe magazine or The Source, where they really dissected the pattern of Mobb Deep, 7 tracks on every album being on the weaker side. So track 7 on Mobb Deep albums up until that point had been known to kind of contain the song that was skippable or, forgettable. And on this one, the 7th song is I Can Never Get Enough of It, or Can't Get Enough of It. And this is not a song that you hear, talked about a lot. It is one of the songs that are easy to overlook, but I don't know if it brings the album down. It just doesn't have enough personality of its own when you compare it and contrast it to songs like Hell on Earth, Nighttime Vultures, Man Down, or any other songs that you could first pop in mind when you think of this album. But I thought that was interesting. That was some real, that's some real investigative hip-hop journalism back when that stuff mattered. I'd love to see more articles like that. But I always remember that, because I remember like, oh damn, I didn't even think of this song. But it'd be interesting to know what you all think are the weakest songs on the album. Do you think some of those softer beat songs are whack? Or is Bloodsport, Extortion, and Hell on Earth forgettable because those are softer productions? Do you just want the hard Man Down beats, Still Shining, Apostles Warning stuff? Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. This album, the timing of it was really, really, really important to how it worked and how it did. This is the rise of the mixtape era. This is where Clue tapes became a household name. This is where exclusives meant something. This is where there was competition to see who would release the first song. This is where street singles still matter. So I mentioned Still Shining being an early release, and that was rotating on the DJ circuit for almost the greater part of half a year before this album came out. So it almost seemed like old news. So the first lead single official being Hell on Earth, was a nice little departure from that. And it was more radio ready because it was a softer song, but it was still a risk. It didn't sound like anything else that was out at the time. It wasn't necessarily a club song or a traditional radio song. And the video, this was the beginning of big budget videos. The video was dark, but had a lot of special effects. And you just see a new look and feel from Mobb Deep, but they were still the same old tried and tested duo that people would come to expect. So that was the first official single. So of course, before that, the real release, the real first single release was Drop a Gem on Him, which wound up being pulled, and then Hell on Earth was the first one to come out. All right, so this album went on to sell. I mentioned how Mobb Deep fit on all platforms, and it rings true because they had a female audience. Even doing the unconventional things they were doing, they had a female audience, they had radio play. Their songs got played in the club by default just because of the undeniable, appeal of them and the boom bap and the hitting, maybe even the tempo of some of those songs. They just work in the club environment, and the mixtapes were in favor of them. Some of that was the bias inherent from DJ Clue. He was gonna play Queen's artists no matter what at that time, and it just helped bolster their reputation and their sound. It just seemed very ubiquitous. Mobb Deep was everywhere that year, and then the extra verse that comes on Hell on Earth made up for whatever softness could be perceived from that production, because Prodigy came back and that verse was being quoted for days. Whatever it takes, however it got to go down, that is a memorable verse. And it's nothing new for Prodigy. He did the same thing on the end of Give Up the Goods on the Infamous album, but those things helped to bolster the buzz and the rep and the anticipation of an album. And that's what this did. It wound up going gold 1 year later, and that's with 3 singles. This is still the era of 3 singles and 3 videos. Now, without the strength of the New York fan base, I wonder how strong this album would have performed, because it breaks so many of the rules. Nothing here super catchy hooks. We're still talking about Havoc mostly doing these long sentence hooks that I mentioned in one of the previous episodes, where I mentioned Mobb Deep being famous for doing these paragraph hooks, right? Hell on Earth, who's next is gonna be first, the projects is front line, and the enemy is one time, I ain't gotta tell you, it's right in front of your eyes. Like, that is the hook. There's no repeated part. You just repeat that whole paragraph for your hook. That is what flew in New York back in these days. And so, really interesting. By no measures were Mobb Deep doing anything that should have worked, but it did, because it's still the mid-90s. And something I'll mention in the next dimension when we go to, we're at the height of the East Coast, West Coast beef, and Mobb Deep was dead smack in the middle of being embroiled in it. They were one of the leading faces and voices of this beef. So that also helped solidify New York's support behind them at this time. And something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5. Heartbeats, Dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. Okay, so let's talk impact. The first official single, Drop a Gem on Him, started circulating on the mixtapes, and everybody understood it was a response to Tupac. This happened only a month or so before Tupac's passing, to which Mobb Deep made the decision to remove that single from circulation. Not from the album, but they changed course and decided not to have this be a single. There was no video for it, but they were ready. So Drop a Gem on Him has all of these subliminals. Even though the entire song is about Tupac, they chose to go the subliminal route and not say his name. And this makes it the only official song released during Tupac being alive that was a direct answer to Hit 'Em Up. And, Mobb Deep doesn't get a lot of credit for that, but, there are a lot of songs that came afterwards that, took shots at Tupac. I'm thinking Chino XL, I'm thinking some Biggie songs, but this was the only song while Tupac was still alive that was going to come out and came out. It just got pulled, and so it didn't get that visual push behind it. And for good reason. Mobb Deep would have been on the wrong side of history had they gone all out with an answer video and things like that. So it's best that it became kind of this like stifled single that you could still hear on the album. I mentioned jokingly in the beginning, sometimes, when I don't feel like skipping, I just let it play, because it doesn't change the sonic cohesion of the album. It doesn't change the theme. It's a violent rap album about, approaching enemies and being harder than the next man, pause. And that song just kind of goes in line with it. And because they're not mentioning Tupac by name, it sounds like all the other songs. And legend has it that, there are other songs on this album where they're taking subliminals at Tupac. And some of the lines even sound like they're talking about Tupac after the passing away, because this album came out in November, so they did have time to, make new material even after his passing. But it's debatable, right? It's debatable. And nevertheless, what that created was controversy. And we're talking about the middle of the East Coast, West Coast beef, right before things got silenced by Tupac's death, where everybody was kind of like maybe, putting more thought into what they put out. But, Mobb Deep had also been a big presence and behind the single LA, which introduced Capone and Noriega to the world. So they were there, they were addressing Snoop Dogg and Dogg Pound crushing the buildings. They were addressing being called out by Tupac on Hit 'Em Up. They were addressing all of the tension and doubling down on, the hardcore toughness of New York not sitting back, and at least their circle, their section that they represented, not going for that. And so that's just gonna generate buzz and controversy and make people wanna pry a little bit more to see what they're talking about on this album, because they stood up. They raised the flag for New York, again, at least for their section. So that's one, when we're talking about impact. And then innovation, Havoc is playing with new feels in production that already existed, that he and RZA were instrumental into shaping as a New York sound. And I think a lot of underground rap followed suit after this album. The production copycats and the production influence was just rampant after this album, hearing dark, haunting beats everywhere on the underground circuit. A part of the innovation is the fact that this was also the beginning of this era of these enhanced CDs, where the understanding that people now had home PCs, personal computers that they were utilizing for recreation and playing their music on was coming into the industry, and a lot of albums were being packaged with this extra, with these features, these bonus things. Go here and get an extra song, or see the video for this, or an exclusive video. And Mobb Deep's Hell on Earth was one of the first albums that had that on their enhanced CD. I think there was an extra video, and there was this bonus song called The Long Run, or In the Long Run. And on that song, the buzz had also started circulating that they were dissing Keith Murray. And I mean, it wasn't a regular diss. Prodigy was talking about something that he goes in depth in his book, My Infamous Life, his autobiography, about how deep the beef with Keith Murray was, that I don't think was very publicized back then. But he says straight out on that song, Keith Murray was about to get shot in that night that we had a fight. And it details this sequence of events where, Keith Murray punches him, and, he had followed him with intent to shoot him. Those kinds of things generate controversy, talk, and just wanting to know what these guys are gonna say next. That's innovation and impact right there. And then the imagery. We didn't know Mobb Deep had a logo until this album. At this point, all of the members of Mobb Deep and Infamous Mobb had got this dragon tattooed on their hands, and that's what's on the cover with this fiery background. Simple, understated, but made a bold statement. And later on, when they came out with an Infamous clothing line, that still kind of resonated. But all of that played into this newness, this sequel feel. And also the sampling of gangster movies in a new way, like not just using audio clips of the characters talking, but sample from the music used in these movies. We started seeing more of that too. So lots of impact, innovation, and influence from this album, and something that could sit on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to the last dimension, dimension 10, the overall uniqueness and timelessness of this album. Where does it stand when you line it up next to other rap albums in general, and also from its time? Now, this stands out as Mobb Deep's probably their darkest album. Maybe not their most popular album, because people still hold a candle for Infamous and the album that came after this, Murder Music, but this is hands down their darkest album, maybe the most cinematic album. And if you put it in now, because of the crackling sounds that Havoc uses to give it this old time feel anyway, it really gives that effect still. It lingers. You know, that production remains. It's crisp to this day because of the sounds used, but it captures, it's like a time capsule of the mid-90s New York hip-hop, the boom bap feel, without sounding dated, which is a feat. Except for exaggerated violence and street talk, you know, it still stands alone because there are not many albums that were able to be this dark and commercially accessible. Would love to hear what you think. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that concludes our Category 1 review of Hell on Earth by Mobb Deep. Yeah, leave your votes and scores down below. You can check out the Rap Ruler website and app coming soon in full-scale launch, but the mini launch is happening, and you'll also be able to find this shirt there. Until then, y'all know what it is. F a Rap Critic. You talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.